Yep, those three are available. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to take a seat, there's some folding chairs out there. If anyone needs to place to sit. Thank you all for coming out to the Main Street Museum tonight. And I want to thank Daisy Rockwell for being here with us and exhibiting her beautiful paintings, which are a little edgy. Edgy and Warhol-esque. Dan Ford couldn't be with us tonight, but so I'm standing in my scrubs. And Daisy is going to read tonight some excerpts from her new novel, Taste, that she's been working on the past 2 years. And I'm very much looking forward to that. And looks like we have a very nice crowd, so you all are as well. So after the reading, there will be a short book signing in the reading room. Please join us for that. And I'm going to get my barking dog, who's always competing for attention. And again, thank you for coming, and I'll pass this over to Daisy.
Okay, can you hear me properly? Good? Okay. Thank you, Mark. He's done a lot of work setting this up over a long period of time. And thank you, David, who's not here, unfortunately.
He's always with us.
But he's with us and he's above us. And thank you, Nancy, for costuming me, because when I came in and I saw the ambiance, I realized that I wasn't appropriately attired. So Nancy supplied the costume, and also the jewelry is from Revolution, which I think is still open if you need something like that to kind of round out your day. So this is my first novel, and it's my first time reading my first novel. And you're the first people to hear anything from my first novels. It's all extremely experimental, and another reason why I had to dress like a lady novelist, so I look appropriate. If you're familiar with my other work, it's not really like those things. I was thinking, what's a good analogy? If you remember back in the days of Blockbuster, you'd see a sort of, if you liked terms of endearment, you'd love Steel Magnolias. So that's not the case with my book. Like, if you liked my other things, I don't know if you'd like this or not. It's not the same. So we'll see. It'll be kind of a group experiment. So the novel is called Taste, and I started writing it in 2006, and it had a checkered career, and but you can't believe that something so small would take so much effort and so many people to get it together, but there it is. And so I'm going to read some excerpts, and I don't really know because I haven't done this before. I don't know how long they'll take me. So, if it starts to kind of drag on and everyone looks restless, I'll just put it down and I'll stop reading and let it go. The book is about it's a first-person narrative about a disturbed, kind of waspy man in his 30s who becomes increasingly obsessed with a Victorian table that his step-grandmother had, and which he wished he had inherited, but he didn't. And it has like a kind of a case with wax fruits in it and then a glass top. So he goes on this kind of quest to try to find it, and of course, inevitably, this makes him and drives him to madness eventually, because he's a very obsessive character. So the first part I'm going to read is a little bit about his childhood that kind of gives you the idea of his psychology, and I know there are a lot of mental health workers here, so they want to know the background of this person. As a young boy, I had collected tastes, the taste of things I had eaten or heard of someone eating, and things that could be drunk. Unlike other children who recoiled in disgust at the very sight of new and unfamiliar foods, I relished and sought out such opportunities in order to add to my collection, no matter how repulsive a new taste sensation might be to me. Much to the chagrin of my parents, however, my willingness To experiment did not lead to a spirit of open-mindedness about the cuisines I had sampled. When engaging in games of one-upmanship with the parents of my contemporaries, my mother never mentioned the aftermath of my experiments. On one occasion, I recall that I had seen an advertisement in the newspaper for a new Ethiopian restaurant in the neighboring town. I insisted that my parents take me to the restaurant as soon as possible, even though they themselves were not too keen on the new taste sensations that Ethiopian food might make available to them. The restaurant occupied the former premises of an Italian-American establishment in a small, low-lying strip mall along a fairly busy section of a bypass route near the town next door. My parents were reluctant to dine in a strip mall, but they were proud of their son's adventuresomeness and wanted to make a go of it. Like a family of explorers, we set out for the Cafe Addis Ababa. The restaurant was near deserted, although the parking lot was busy due to the presence of two much larger and more successful businesses on the lot, a video rental store and a popular submarine sandwich shop. We sat as far back in the restaurant as we could, away from the large plate glass windows looking out onto the bustling parking lot and the endless lines of cars whizzing by, in order, as my father put it, to see if we can't pretend to be in some little dive in Ethiopia. The new proprietors of the restaurant had done little to change the decor since their arrival. The walls were papered in a dark red and gold swirling pattern, and the sides of the room were lined with dark wooden booths, their seats upholstered in ketchup red vinyl. Two chandeliers were suspended from the ceiling by heavy-looking linked chains. Each light bulb was pointed like a candle flame and ensconced in a heavy gold glass floret, which caused them to cast a muted golden glow about the room. There were still maps of Italy on the walls and enlarged photographs mounted on foam board of Italian peasant women at harvest time carrying baskets of wheat and tomatoes. Over our table hung a floridly painted still life of a bowl of fruit with a bottle of wine. The paint was thickly layered onto what must have been an old mirror. My father, an art historian, groaned softly when he saw this, but managed to take the painting in stride for the duration of the meal. The tablecloths were red and white checked. Even the china and glasses seemed to have been inherited from the previous owners. I was in high spirits in anticipation of this new addition to my collection. I had never collected anything at all from Africa, and beyond an order of Chinese takeout acquired in Boston when we had gone there to visit the museum, this was really my first foray outside the cuisines of the Americas and Europe. Over my parents' objections, I insisted we order everything on the menu, promising earnestly that I would personally be responsible for consuming all the leftovers we brought home. The most thrilling moment of the evening was when the waiter brought out the large piece of cushiony bread that we were all to share, and carefully spooned out 6 small piles of food from 6 different dishes onto the bread. I was fascinated by the fact that each pile looked almost exactly like the other, especially with respect to color. This would require me to collect the taste using my taste buds alone. I would have no help from visual cues, and no other way to remember the experience besides through my tongue. I had taken out a number of books from the library on the different tastes experienced by the different areas of the tongue, and this meal would represent my first opportunity to put into practice what I had read in the total absence of familiarity, expectation, or visual data. It was to be a true scientific experiment. I had already taken out my taste collection diary and fountain pen and written down the names of all the dishes we had ordered. When the waiter had finished serving us, I asked him to identify each pile by name, and then I drew a diagram of the bread and the food on the bread, each item properly labeled. My parents sat by silently, not sure if they should dig in before my diagram was done, or how they should interpret my behavior for the waiter. My mother laughed nervously and looked up at the waiter. "It's a class project," she said, "foods of the world." The waiter stared blankly at her and then smiled warily. He was not sure if he should go away or if I was going to require more information of him. Looking at the clock, he held the tray behind his back and shifted from one foot to the other. When I had finished my writing, I looked up at him and said firmly, "Thank you." That seemed to be enough to initiate the collection had arrived. Being at that time quite short for my age, my face was close to the food. The steam from the different piles of, or curries, as my father called them, fogged up my glasses, thus reducing reliance on my visual faculties even further. This, in turn, augmented the sensation that I was embarking on my collection project, which was also part experiment in Plato's cave. The story of Plato's cave had been read to me from an authoritative translation of ancient Greek by my Uncle Ned, a, quote, non-union scholar of classics, as he called himself, following a large Thanksgiving meal which had rendered everyone but him and me incapable of speech or interaction for a good 3 hours. During that time, Uncle Ned, in an exceedingly gregarious mood due to excessive alcohol consumption, according to my mother, undertook to give me, at the age of 8, a solid grounding in the classics. I was so flattered that I had been chosen for this indoctrination, as he termed it, on the very basis of our civilization, that I didn't want to interrupt him in the flow of his readings and explications. Thus, to this day, the power of that indoctrination and my hazy understanding of much of what I was told continues to muddle my perception of many of the basic tenets of Greek and Roman philosophy, mythology, and history, despite the best efforts of subsequent preceptors. It was thus that I developed an understanding of Plato's cave as something to do with the optimal conditions under which an experiment should be conducted. The men sitting in the cave were there to study the human condition. By doing so with their backs to the distracting swirl of sensations represented by immersion in everyday life, they had achieved a greater degree of objectivity. They watched the silhouettes or shadows of humankind intently as they faced inside the cave. The movement of these shadows presented them with certain objective truths that would not have been available to them under normal circumstances. And so, I approached my Ethiopian taste collection project in a manner which fairly reduplicated the objectivity of the scientists in Plato's cave, though of course there was still the troubling notion of the interaction between taste buds and smell, the latter of which I was not entirely sure I should yet forego, though later experiments with more familiar tastes were to involve clamping my nose shut with a clothespin. The waiter had placed 5 piles in a circle and a 6th at the center. I decided to bring it at the top of the circle at 12 o'clock, then proceed clockwise, ending up in the middle. I took a small spoonful off the pile at 12 o'clock and placed it on my plate. I also tore off a small section of the bread and placed it beside the spoonful of food. My parents tried to convince me to eat the food with the bread as a scoop, as we had seen a couple of diners across the restaurant doing. I refused, however, believing this to be less scientific than eating each item separately. The first spoonful of food, along with each subsequent spoonful, was unremittingly spicy, no doubt due to what I believed to be chili peppers, a substance I had only read about. I had no tolerance for hot food, which meant that this experiment would require a steely resolve. I catalogued the results of each bite on my diagram, and below, where I had a notes section, wiping the steam from my glasses and blinking through the tears of pain. I carefully noted the degrees of hotness for each item and attempted to describe the experience of my taste buds, carefully moving bites of food from one area of my tongue to the next. My parents, after some misgivings, had decided that they were happy with the food and were busily making their way through their dinners. They were accustomed to my collecting of tastes and talked between themselves every now and then, gazing anxiously over at me, notebooks spread out, eyes watering with pain, glasses smudged, my plate covered with small dabs of food, carefully placed so as not to run into one another and taint the discrete tastes that were entering my collection. By the time I had completed my project, I felt overwhelmed with waves of nausea that could barely be controlled. "Are you all right, dear?" my mother asked. "She looks a little pale," my father said. By then I was sure I was going to vomit. My mother waved for the check, and my father led me out of the restaurant into the parking lot, which was full of video store patrons pulling in and out of parking spots. Seeing my mortification at the thought of vomiting in front of so many people, my father took me behind a large green dumpster at the side of the complex, where I promptly disgorged my entire meal, as well as the balance of the contents of my stomach. So I'm skipping ahead. He's been on a cross-country kind of tour trying to find this table, and it took him to Mississippi, to Oxford, Mississippi, and he took the train because he was afraid of flying. He took the train to Chicago, and then he had to spend a whole day in Chicago, and then down to Memphis, and then he had a taxi take him to Oxford, Mississippi, and it was fruitless and very frustrating adventure. And so this part, he's on his way back up. And in the meantime, there's all sorts of intrigue going on, and he's begun to suspect that his best friend Roger has betrayed him in some way, is either hiding something from him, and is also carrying on with an archivist that was a mutual friend of theirs. So he's having overwhelmed with these feelings of betrayal. And Roger had told him to drop in on Graceland just because it would be fun and campy, he said. And so, of course, our narrator is not pleased with the idea of doing something fun and campy at all. And I chose this passage to read is actually for David, but of course, David, I can't hear it because I've talked about it. Oh, wait, there is David back there. So this is for you, David. It's about campiness. Yes, they were just there. Because I think one of the main volumes of the original library was Susan Sontag's On Camp Book Museum. So this is an important part about that. So he's had decided not to go to Graceland, but he didn't realize that he's going to have to wait in Memphis for a long time. After walking around the waiting room a few times, and of course he's starting to really go a little mad at this point. After walking around the waiting room a few times and glancing at the publications, at the newsstand, and at the refreshments available at the small snack counter, I stopped before a poster for Graceland. I felt angry with Roger just looking at this piece of poorly designed publicity and the photographs of the ridiculously gaudy interior of the house. Ah, but it was camp. Very well then, I thought. I will go and experience this camp value in which everyone finds so much amusement. I would view the house and purchase the postcard I had promised Roger, because he said, get me a postcard, send me a postcard. So he's disgusted with that sentiment of his. I would purchase the postcard I had promised Roger, and then I would return and dine somewhere close to the station. It was a fateful decision, and not one taken in a sound frame of mind. When I look back at what transpired since then, it is clear to me that had I not gone to view the Graceland mansion in Memphis, things might have gone better for me in the long run. And so I went. I felt almost tearful on the taxi ride back to the station. After the ghastly excesses of rooms on public display at Graceland, opulence, as it was described in a brochure, I was unable to contemplate eating anything when I returned to the station. I sat instead for some time on a bench, experiencing waves of nausea that overtook me with each recollection of the tour. At times I would pace. I purchased a newspaper but did not read it. Eventually I bought a chocolate bar, a sandwich wrapped in cellophane, and a bottle of orange juice for later, should I regain my appetite on the train ride to Chicago. When the train finally arrived, I sat in my compartment and did not venture forth. I assumed the dining car would be closed. I would have been happy to have a drink and was almost tempted to go to the bar car, but it was quite late at night and I had begun to feel hungry. I attempted to eat what I could with the sandwich, egg salad, for nourishment. As I picked at the crumbs on the plastic wrapping, I gazed out into the darkness through the scratched windows and imagined the receding southern landscape. I was exhausted, but knew it was fruitless to attempt sleep. I opened up my notebook to record my thoughts. I had intended to write about Graceland, about my disgust at the tawdry furnishings that were meant to convey a sense of luxury, but instead provided evidence of a gaping, empty soul. In a calmer frame of mind, I might have even made a list of the rooms and described their contents and their effect on me. I would have critiqued the tour, the labeling of the displays, and the items available in the gift shop. But try as I might, I simply could not bring myself to describe even a single chandelier. Instead, my heart was filled with increasing rage at Roger, who, knowing me as well as he did, had blithely sent me on this errand for a postcard. A postcard! I took out the postcard in question, which I had slipped between the pages of the Bauhaus book, that he was carrying a very heavy Bauhaus book with him. The postcard showed a sitting room furnished with 2 asymmetrical chaises longs, upholstered in magenta, where one was to rest one's back, and white across the long seating area. The chaises longs were joined to form a sort of curvy L shape. Next to the chaise longue was a magenta armchair, and these 3 items were all grouped around a hideous coffee table with a glass top and a large base made of 3 flat white curlicues. All these furnishings were placed on an indigo carpet with a wide leopard print margin. The walls were alternately painted apricot and lavender. I had admittedly chosen a card that I thought would make a rather pointed statement to Roger. Perhaps upon seeing the grotesque interior design pictured on the card, he would realize that he had erred in sending me to Graceland. I did not necessarily hope for an apology, but perhaps a modicum of regret. I turned the card over and thought of what to write. I would keep it short due to the motion of the train. I wrote, "Dear Roger, here is the postcard of Graceland, as promised. It is indeed replete with camp value, as you had indicated. It is value that unfortunately is lost on this correspondent. The weather has been sunny and quite warm in comparison to New England at this time of year. Sincerely yours, Daniel." As I wrote, the train did lurch several times, forcing me to produce an example of penmanship that was not up to my usual standards. In some areas, there were smudges where my hand had slipped. Now he gets into Chicago, and things are getting worse and worse for him. Arriving in Chicago a bit after 9 in the morning, I went first to the station bathroom to shave, so as not to repeat my previous mistake of shaving in a moving train. I took my suitcase with me as it contained my shaving kit. After relieving myself in a poorly maintained stall, I set up my shaving materials at a sink and set to work. Though I was no longer hampered by the constraints I had faced in the compartment, I had not anticipated my anxiety with regard to shaving in a public place. At that hour, the tail end of the commuter crowd was streaming through the station, and the toilets were in high demand, with large numbers of men in dark suits and lightweight fall coats entering and exiting the facility. I found myself turning my head every time the door opened, and then looking away quickly for fear that someone might think I was trying to catch their eye. This inevitably resulted in some nicks on my chin and my upper lip. I washed my shaving implements with care and set them about the sink, and then returned to one of the toilet stalls to fetch a few sheets of toilet paper with which to stanch the small traces of blood on my face. I now had the distinct impression of drawing stares from the men entering the room. I turned and looked at myself in the mirror to see if there was something untoward about my appearance. I looked slightly disheveled since I had had no bath, but there seemed to be nothing especially noticeable to attract attention. I pressed a long sheet of toilet paper against my cuts, then hurriedly folded up the paper, placed it in the trash, and packed up my shaving kit. I repacked the kit in my suitcase and shut the clasp. As I lifted the suitcase by the handles, half the clasp snapped off. It had finally broken. I was convinced that the Bauhaus book was the culprit. It was a large, heavy book, and the case was certainly not intended for the transport of such articles. I knelt down and put my arms around the suitcase to hug it shut. Then I stood up and carried it in this manner, close to my chest, out of the bathroom. The gentleman entering the bathroom was kind enough to hold the door for me. At the luggage check, I asked the attendant if he had anything with which I might keep the suitcase firmly shut. There was no tape to be found behind the counter, but he was finally able to locate a stout length of twine, which we wound around the case several times and knotted. I checked the case and then asked for directions to the nearest post office, after which I set off on my walk through the city. Then I'm going to skip ahead. He goes to the museum for a while, and then he goes out to the Russian tea room, which he'd visited before, which is very near the museum. When I cast my mind back to the events of my trip, looking for mistakes I might have made, I regret that the drinks I ordered at the tea room for lunch that day were in point of fact excessive for the occasion, though they were extremely enjoyable at the time. I have long felt that taking drink at midday does not suit me, but I was unable to resist the temptation of the tea room's flights of vodka this time. I was fatigued and troubled by my trip to Oxford, and had not eaten much in the past day and a half. It was, as my mother would say, the thin end of the wedge. There were many such flights to choose from. I selected the flavored combination of coriander, blackcurrant tea, and lime. Unfortunately, I began the flight before my food had come out, and was already slightly dizzy by the time I began to eat. My face felt warm, and I drank a glass of ice water to cool myself down. I began to notice and feel peeved by the volume of the Russian music being piped in along the wall to the right of my chair. I searched for the speaker, hoping to muffle the sound with a napkin or my knee, but was unable to find the source of these irritating strains of the polka. I desisted from this activity when I noticed a waiter eyeing me suspiciously, but my irritation continued to mount. I didn't care for the strudel I ordered for dessert, and the tea felt tepid. After settling the check, I made my way to the restroom, where I was horrified to discover that the button on my woolen trousers was missing. This was not, I hasten to add, a sign of my overeating, but rather likely due to the vintage of the trousers which had been passed on to me by my Uncle Ned. Ned had decided a few years before to hand down to me all his tailored clothing from his younger days that had long since grown too tight for his increasingly portly frame. I wondered where the button had gone. It would be difficult to replace with the right type of button, as the trousers were at least 50 years old. After washing my hands, I returned to the dining room and asked a waiter if I might search under the table for a missing button. There was already a couple seated at my former table. The waiter looked displeased. He spoke to the couple in a hushed voice. The woman seated in my former chair stood up and looked over at me. She eyed me up and down with a look of disdain on her face, and picking up a large, shiny black purse, she stepped aside from the table and waited for me to search. I approached the table and pulled out the chair. Kneeling down, I looked around on the carpet, which was dark red, patterned with small golden flowers. I tried to remember the color of the button. The trousers were brown, so the button must have been brown as well. I smoothed my hand along the area of the carpet beneath the chair. I could feel the woman's eyes boring into the back of my head. There seemed to be nothing there. I could have lost it anywhere, the museum, the post office, or even the train station. I recalled that it had still been in place, though loose, at the train station when I had used the toilet there. I stood up, bowed to the woman whom I had displaced, and stepped away from the table, making room for her to return to her seat. She studiously looked away from me as she returned to her seat. The waiter also avoided meeting my gaze as I left. So then he goes and buys a new belt, and then he thinks that he'll take a walk. I felt hot about the temples from the flight of vodka, but the heat seemed pleasant in a way as I walked back down the boulevard in the chilly late autumn breeze. There was a small cafe along the way that served wine, and I wondered if perhaps a little more to drink might keep me warm. There were 6 hours left until my train departed. I entered the cafe and ordered a glass of wine at the counter, as well as a large oatmeal raisin cookie, so as not to appear to be there simply for the drink. The cookie would do for a snack later in the evening. I sat at a small round table near the window and watched the pedestrians walking briskly to and fro. The wine was not bad, and it revived me somewhat. Feeling it was time to return to my thoughts on the table, I took out my notebook. When I opened it, my ticket to Graceland fell out, and my sense of well-being immediately shattered. I thought not just of Roger's betrayal of my aesthetic sensibilities, which I had always felt to be in many ways our shared aesthetic, but also his betrayal of my trust. It was all but certain that he was now engaged in some sort of dalliance with Antoinette. How could it not be so? And yet they were so poorly matched. And why had he kept this a secret from me? My notes became scrawled and incoherent, and my mood was degenerating. I quickly downed the rest of my wine and hurried back out into the late afternoon, turning my steps towards the museum. I just want to read one little other thing. He has more to drink and he feels much worse because he reads an issue of the New Yorker that repeatedly references camp values of things, and it makes him very depressed. So then he goes back to the station to wait. Walking out into the street, I felt slightly dizzy. I had only a few blocks to walk to the station, and then I would uncheck my suitcase and wait for the train. This I managed to accomplish without incident. Returning from the luggage check with my suitcase hugged to my chest, I sat down at the end of a long wooden bench and prepared for my wait. I neglected my usual practice of keeping reading or writing material open on my lap, however, something that helps one avoid untoward conversations in public places. Because of this oversight, I was soon enough approached by an unusually tall, thin man of very pale complexion who wore a cheaply made light gray suit. Mind if I sit here? He asked as he perched gingerly on the bench right next to me in preference to the vast, empty expanse of bench available to him. I smiled faintly and looked away. He remarked then on the weather and the changing of the seasons, unoriginal observations, in response to which I politely nodded and avoided eye contact. Then he withdrew a large, heavy book from a voluminous shoulder bag made of homespun sackcloth and asked if I would like to take a look. I did not wish to take a look, but he held it out across my lap, and I took it, mostly in the hopes that he would withdraw his long, bony hand from my general vicinity. It contains all the answers to the world's problems, he said with a peaceful smile. In fact, all the answers to the universe's problems, he added with emphasis. I opened the book and was faintly repelled by the strange layout of the pages, a cacophony of words and images, italics and bold-faced print, all jumbled together with cartoonish illustrations of what appeared to be deities, mortals, and many large white horses. Thank you, I said, shoving the cover and handing it back to him. I noticed as he took the book that his hair seemed slightly off-kilter and realized that he must be wearing a wig. The man took my prolonged gaze as encouragement and offered to sell me the book for the price of $10. No, thank you, I responded. I have no room in my luggage for anything that large. Not easily discouraged, he removed from his bag a set of small pamphlets whose cover designs were remarkably austere in comparison to the book. No problem, he said. Why don't you take some of these? I'm sorry, but I really don't wish to buy anything at the moment, I replied. Free of charge, he said with a wide smile. Hurry on, I added. Well, thank you, I said stiffly, taking the pamphlets and stuffing them into my pocket. I turned my head and looked away to signal that our conversation had come to an end. I was surprised to see, at that very moment, a man letting go of a baby carriage at the top of the large sweeping staircase that marked the entrance of the station. The baby carriage went bouncing horribly down the steps as everyone stood by watching it, seemingly unconcerned. Then the man took out a large gun and proceeded to fire it at a number of passers-by, all of whom fell to the ground. Horrified, I stood up, wondering if there was something I should do. They're filming a commercial for the man, still sitting next to me on the bench. It's a reenactment from a scene of a famous film that was shot here. Oh, I see. I sat down, my heart still pounding from watching a baby plunge to its death. The carriage was lying on its side at the bottom of the staircase, a baby doll lying nearby, and I now noticed the film crew and a profusion of film lights gathered to one side at the foot of the stairway. The victims of the shooting were all standing up now, dusting off their clothes. It's all Maya, the man explained with a knowing smile. The illusion of the material world. I see, I said, fixing my gaze on my hands clasped in my lap, willing the man to go away. Well, I must be going, he said after a long silence. It's been great talking to you. I'm Romwell, by the way. He held the palms of his hands together. Namaste.